It was the kind of moment daytime television lives for the sort of shocking, unscripted confrontation that spreads across social media within minutes and keeps viewers talking for weeks. What happens when a Hollywood legend, a woman who has spent decades commanding screens, stages, and protests, finally decides she's done tolerating interruptions? And what happens when she chooses to push back, verbally and unapologetically, against one of the most outspoken hosts in daytime history? Well, what unfolded that morning was nothing short of a verbal earthquake, one of the most brutal on-air takedowns ever witnessed on The View. Jane Fonda didn't just defend herself, she utterly dismantled Joy Behar with a calm, razor-sharp precision that left the entire studio frozen in disbelief. By the time the smoke cleared, Joy looked like she wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Make sure to hit subscribe and drop a comment below, because you're about to hear a story that is equal parts dramatic, unexpected, and absolutely wild. It all began like any other ordinary Tuesday morning on The View. The cameras were positioned, the lights were blazing, and the studio audience buzzed with the lively energy that the show is famous for. Producers moved in every direction, adjusting microphones and signaling the hosts. Joy Behar, Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Haynes, and the rest of the panel were seated behind the iconic curved table, reviewing their note cards and sipping their morning coffees. Everything was running smoothly, almost predictably, until their guest walked on stage. That morning's special guest was none other than Jane Fonda, a name that has commanded respect in Hollywood for more than 60 years. At 86 years old, she was still a force, an actress, an activist, a fitness icon, and a woman who had lived through more reinventions than most people experience in a lifetime. She had come on the show to talk about her newest project, something she was genuinely passionate about, something she wanted to share with the world. But nobody, not the audience, not the viewers at home, and definitely not Jane Fonda herself, expected the interview to take the sudden, heated turn it took. The moment she stepped onto the set, the audience erupted into thunderous applause. Jane looked stunning, a crisp white blazer draped over her shoulders, her silver hair styled with effortless grace, her posture straight and commanding. There was a calm dignity about her, the kind that only comes from a lifetime of navigating fame, criticism, triumph, and reinvention. She smiled warmly, giving a small wave as she walked toward her seat, her presence powerful yet serene. She settled into the guest chair with ease, crossing her legs, adjusting her blazer, and preparing herself for what she assumed would be a routine interview. The hosts leaned in with their rehearsed smiles, but the atmosphere shifted the moment Joy Behar opened her mouth. Joy had always been outspoken, unfiltered, opinionated, and sometimes abrasive, but that morning she seemed especially confrontational. Instead of focusing on Jane's new project, Joy began steering the conversation toward personal territory, probing questions, snide remarks, and interruptions that felt less like curiosity and more like provocation. At first, Jane handled it the way a seasoned professional handles unnecessary hostility, with grace, controlled smiles, and attempts to redirect the conversation. But Joy kept pushing. Each interruption cut deeper, becoming more dismissive, more personal, almost as if she was trying to corner Jane or get a reaction out of her. And that's when everything changed. Jane Fonda, known for her activism, resilience, and refusal to be silenced even in the face of government scrutiny decades earlier, reached her limit. Her expression shifted, calm, sharp, almost icy. The audience went silent, sensing the tension thickening in the air. Even Whoopi glanced sideways, recognizing that something major was about to happen. Joy interrupted Jane one more time, cutting her off mid-sentence with a dismissive laugh and a comment that crossed the line between hosting and hostility. Jane placed her hand on the table, leaned forward just slightly, and fixed her gaze on Joy. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, and controlled, not angry, not emotional, but deadly precise. It was the tone of someone who had spent a lifetime standing up to critics, and was not about to let herself be belittled on live television. What followed was a verbal takedown so elegantly executed that it bordered on poetic. Jane confronted the behavior directly, calling out the interruptions, the disrespect, and Joy's habit of dominating conversations instead of fostering them. She did it with intelligence, confidence, and the kind of controlled fire that only an experienced legend could deliver. The crowd didn't cheer, they didn't gasp, they simply froze. The studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras humming. Joy, stunned and visibly shaken, tried to recover, but Jane kept speaking, every word hitting with calm accuracy. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was simply the truth, delivered by someone who had absolutely nothing left to prove. By the time she finished, Joy Behar looked rattled, embarrassed, and completely out of her depth. Her forced smile faltered. She shifted in her chair, glancing awkwardly at the cue cards she suddenly didn't seem to know what to do with. The rest of the panel sat silent, unsure whether to intervene or just let the moment breathe. Jane, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair, posed, unbothered, and entirely in control. She had said what needed to be said, and she had said it with the kind of authority only a Hollywood titan could wield. And that moment, raw, unexpected, unforgettable, became one of the most talked-about confrontations in The View's history. "Welcome back to The View, Jane," Whoopi Goldberg said with genuine warmth, her voice carrying the familiar steadiness of someone who had spent decades mastering live television. The audience burst into applause, clearly thrilled to see the Hollywood legend sitting at the table once again. Whoopi smiled and added, "It's always such a pleasure to have you here." "Thank you for having me," Jane replied, returning the smile with effortless grace. Her tone was warm, calm, and steady, exactly what one would expect from someone who had spent most of her life in the spotlight. "It's wonderful to be back," she continued as she settled deeper into her seat, smoothing her crisp blazer and crossing her legs. Even in her 80s, she carried herself with a mixture of poise and strength that commanded attention without demanding it. But before Jane could even adjust the microphone clip to her lapel, Joy Behar decided to make her presence known, with absolutely zero subtlety. "So, Jane, I have to ask you about something that's been bothering me." Joy leaned forward, her tone sharp and confrontational, the kind of tone that warned everyone watching that she was not easing into this interview gently. "You've been very vocal about climate change and activism, but don't you think it's a bit hypocritical coming from someone who spent decades flying around in private jets and living in massive mansions?" The question crashed into the room like a brick through a window. A few gasps rippled through the studio audience, and even the camera operators seemed to stiffen. The other hosts exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances. Sarah raised her eyebrows, Sunny shifted in her chair, and Whoopi leaned back with a sigh, clearly sensing the tension that Joy was determined to escalate. Jane's expression shifted, subtle and not anger, not shock, but something colder, sharper. She inhaled slowly, maintaining her composure with the discipline of a woman who's handled tougher interviews, harsher critics, and more brutal scrutiny. "Well, Joy, I think that's an interesting way to start an interview," Jane said, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I've been transparent about my past and the changes I've made in my lifestyle. I've reduced my carbon footprint significantly and used my platform to raise awareness about climate issues." It was a perfectly reasonable answer. Calm, mature, honest, but Joy wasn't having it. She leaned even further forward, elbows on the table, her voice rising like someone trying to provoke a fight. "But come on, Jane, you can't just say you've changed and expect everyone to forget about your lavish lifestyle. You're telling regular people to make sacrifices while you live in luxury. Don't you see the problem with that?" The tension in the room thickened. A murmur rolled through the audience, some uncomfortable, some intrigued, others sensing that this interview had already derailed from its intended path. The entire atmosphere shifted into something electric and dangerous, the kind of moment where everyone holds their breath because they know something explosive is about to happen. Jane Fonda's eyes narrowed just slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it revealed the spark behind them, the fire that had fueled her activism, the confidence that had carried her through political controversies, and the strength that had made her an icon of American culture. "Joy," Jane began slowly, her voice calm but sharper now, "I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here." She folded her hands together on the table. "Are you interviewing me about my current work, or are you trying to create drama for your show? Because if it's the latter, I think you're going about it the wrong way." A collective gasp swept through the audience. Even Whoopi's eyes widened slightly, though she said nothing, choosing instead to observe the unfolding clash. Joy's face flushed a noticeable shade of red. She clearly hadn't expected Jane to push back, especially not with such precision and confidence. "I am just asking the questions that viewers want answered," Joy stammered, fumbling slightly as she tried to regain control of the conversation. "I'm being honest here." "Honest," Jane repeated, turning fully toward Joy now. She tilted her head slightly, studying her like someone examining a puzzle. "Red alert," Jane added under her breath, but loud enough for the microphones to catch. "I'm getting her," she muttered, as if finally understanding what Joy was really doing. Then Jane's voice grew stronger, still controlled, still elegant, but undeniably forceful. "No, Joy," Jane interrupted, slicing through Joy's attempted justification. "You're being rude and confrontational. There's a difference between honest journalism and whatever it is you're doing right now." A stunned silence fell over the studio. Joy froze, her eyes widening in disbelief, as if she'd just been slapped by words alone. The other hosts sat motionless, watching the scene unfold like spectators at a boxing match, unsure whether they should intervene or stay out of the crossfire. Jane remained perfectly composed, her posture straight, her expression firm, her voice unwavering. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't losing her temper. She wasn't rattled. She was simply drawing a boundary, clearly and unapologetically, in front of millions of viewers. The audience watched in awe, sensing they had just witnessed the beginning of one of the most unforgettable confrontations in daytime television history. Sunny Hostin looked like she wanted to intervene, her hands subtly lifting off the table before she pulled them back, clearly torn between professionalism and concern. Sarah Haynes fidgeted nervously with her stack of note cards, glancing anxiously between Joy and Jane, as if unsure whether to prepare for a commercial break or brace herself for an on-air explosion. And Whoopi Goldberg, always the seasoned anchor, kept her expression unreadable. But even her calm exterior betrayed something, the slight tilt of her head, the way her shoulders tensed just a little. It was the kind of body language that suggested she was ready to step in if things escalated any further. Joy Behar, however, feeling cornered and embarrassed, chose the worst possible option. She doubled down. "I'm sorry if you can't handle tough questions, Jane," Joy snapped, her voice rising with indignation. "But this is The View. We don't do softball interviews here." That was it, the spark, the exact moment everything shifted. Jane Fonda's posture changed instantly. She sat up straighter, shoulders back, chin raised, with the commanding presence of a woman who had spent her life standing up to senators, presidents, critics, activists, and the entire Hollywood establishment. Her eyes ignited with a blaze so intense that the studio lights seemed dim in comparison. "Tough questions," Jane repeated, her voice now sharp enough to slice through steel. The air crackled as every head in the studio turned toward her. "Joy, you call that journalism?" The room froze. "You ambushed me," Jane continued, her voice steady but loaded with fire. "You threw out poorly researched accusations without giving me a chance to properly respond. That's not tough journalism. That's tabloid sensationalism." A wave of murmurs fluttered through the audience before it faded into a tense silence. Joy's mouth opened in protest, but Jane lifted her hand slightly, just enough to signal that she wasn't done, and furthermore. Jane pressed on, her tone now laced with unmistakable authority. "If you had done even the most basic research before this interview, you would know that I've been living in a smaller, eco-friendly home for years. I've eliminated private jet travel from my personal life, and I have donated millions to environmental causes." She paused, letting the weight of her words land. "But you didn't bother to check any of that, did you?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the studio audience, usually lively, quick to applaud, laugh, or gasp, seemed too stunned to breathe. Joy Behar looked genuinely shocked, almost winded, as if Jane's words had knocked the air right out of her. Joy finally managed to stammer out a fragmented reply. "Well, I think our viewers deserve to know about these contradictions," but her voice lacked its usual confidence. It trembled, small and uncertain, the tone of someone desperately trying to pull themselves out of a hole they hadn't expected to fall into. Jane leaned back slowly in her chair, composed and completely in control. A faint, controlled smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, not mocking, but victorious in its own quiet way. "What our viewers deserve, Joy," Jane said, voice cool and steady, "is honest, respectful dialogue. Not whatever this performance is supposed to be." The word performance hit Joy like a physical blow. A visible wave of shock washed over her face. Her complexion went from a heated red to an almost ghostly pale in a matter of seconds. She looked around the table, eyes pleading for backup, some kind of rescue from her co-hosts. But none of them were willing to step into the fire. Sunny kept her eyes down on her notes. Sarah pretended to straighten her papers. Even Whoopi avoided direct eye contact, choosing instead to stare at the camera monitors, as if waiting for a miracle. They had all silently decided that Joy was on her own. "I don't know what you're implying," Joy managed, her voice rising in pitch. Higher, thinner, unmistakably defensive. "I'm not implying anything," Jane replied coolly. "I'm stating it directly." The audience let out a soft collective gasp. "You're performing," Jane continued, her voice now calm enough to be terrifying. "You're trying to create conflict where none needs to exist. It's beneath both of us." Joy Behar swallowed hard, visibly rattled. She had walked into this interview confident, thinking she could corner a Hollywood legend with a few provocative questions. But instead, she was being dismantled, systematically, intellectually, and publicly, by a woman who had spent her life debating senators, resisting government oppression, and standing on the front lines of activism. Joy tried again, clinging to her last shred of authority. "Look, Jane, I'm just trying to hold you accountable for your actions." Jane let out a short laugh, not warm, not amused, more like a sharp exhale of disbelief. "Hold me accountable," she repeated. "Joy, you're a talk show host, not a prosecutor." Sarah's jaw dropped. Sunny blinked in disbelief. A couple of audience members covered their mouths. Jane wasn't done. "And even if you were a prosecutor," she added, tilting her head slightly, "you'd still need to have your facts straight before making accusations." The studio was now so tense, you could practically hear the cameras whirring as they zoomed in on Joy's stunned expression. Millions of viewers watching at home would later replay this moment again and again. The exact second Joy realized she had lost complete control of the interview. The humiliation was brutal, unfiltered, and very, very public. Finally, after watching Joy sink deeper and deeper into her own mess, Whoopi Goldberg decided it was time to step in. She straightened in her chair, preparing to cut through the chaos before the interview collapsed under its own weight. Joy was drowning, and everyone could see it. Whoopi Goldberg cleared her throat and attempted to smooth over the escalating chaos. "Maybe we should move on to talking about your new project, Jane," she suggested gently, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. It was the kind of intervention Whoopi only used when absolutely necessary, when things had gone so far off the rails that the hosts risked losing control of the show entirely. But Joy Behar, now visibly embarrassed and scrambling to save face after being verbally dismantled, made the worst decision she possibly could. Instead of grabbing the life raft Whoopi had thrown her, she slapped it away. "No, wait," Joy said sharply, holding up her hand as if she were the authority in the room. "I think we need to address this properly, Jane." Her voice was rising again, that familiar mix of indignation and defensiveness taking over. "You've made a career out of being controversial. From your time in Vietnam to your various political stances, you've never shied away from stirring the pot. So why are you so sensitive now when someone questions you?" The audacity of that statement hit the room like a thunderclap. Sunny Hostin's eyes widened. Sarah stopped fidgeting and froze. Even Whoopi's face, usually unreadable, cracked for a split second, something between shock and disappointment flickering through her expression. The audience didn't gasp, they didn't murmur, they simply went silent, the way a crowd does before a storm breaks. Jane Fonda's expression changed instantly. It shifted from firm irritation to something much deeper, an anger forged over decades of facing criticism, misrepresentation, and political attacks far harsher than anything Joy Behar was capable of. Sensitive, when Jane finally spoke, her voice was dangerously quiet, so controlled that it made the silence in the room feel even heavier. "Joy," she said slowly, "you clearly don't understand the difference between being controversial and being ignorant." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp as a blade. What you just said proves that you have no idea what you're talking about. Anyone else would have backed down. Anyone else would have realized they'd crossed a line. Anyone else would have read the temperature of the room and pulled back, but not Joy Behar. Joy mistook her own panic for momentum. She pressed forward, doubling down again, blindly, arrogantly, disastrously. "I'm talking about your anti-war protests," she insisted loudly. "Your comments about American soldiers. You can't just rewrite history, Jane." The moment those words left her mouth, the atmosphere in the studio changed completely. The entire set went still. The audience didn't move, didn't breathe. Even the crew members behind the cameras froze mid-motion, their hands suspended above controls and buttons. Joy Behar had crossed the line, the one everyone in the industry knows better than to touch without preparation, nuance, or a mountain of research. Jane Fonda did not move for several seconds. She sat perfectly still, her posture rigid, her face stone. Cold, her eyes blazing with a restrained fury that made her look 10 feet tall. When she finally spoke, her voice had an icy steel to it. "Joy," she said, each syllable cutting through the air, "I'm going to give you one chance. One to retract that statement and apologize." The audience sucked in a collective breath, because what you just said, Jane continued, is not only factually incorrect, it's deliberately inflammatory, and it is deeply disrespectful to me and to the veterans I have worked with for decades. If Joy had even an ounce of self-preservation left in her, she would have apologized. She would have taken the out Jane offered her. She would have shown humility. But instead, fueled by ego and desperation, she made yet another catastrophic mistake. "I don't need to apologize for stating facts," Joy shot back. "Your actions during Vietnam are well documented." The studio temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Jane Fonda stood up slowly, deliberately, placing her hands on the table as she rose. For a moment, it looked like she might walk off the set entirely. The audience leaned forward, unsure whether they were about to witness a walkout, a breakdown, or a confrontation the show would never recover from. But Jane didn't leave. She turned fully to Joy, her posture tall and commanding, her expression carved from stone. And when she spoke again, her voice held the unmistakable authority of someone who had survived political attacks, threats, smear campaigns, and public trials far more brutal than a daytime talk show argument. "Facts," Jane repeated. "You want facts, Joy." Her tone was controlled but carried the weight of decades of lived truth. "Let me give you some facts." The audience held their breath. "I spent 2 years visiting wounded veterans in hospitals," Jane said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I have worked with veteran organizations for over 50 years. Joy blinked, suddenly unsure of herself. "I have apologized, repeatedly, for any pain my actions caused," Jane continued, "publicly, privately, personally." She took a small step closer, not threatening, but powerful in her stillness. "And I have dedicated significant portions of my life to supporting our troops in ways you clearly know nothing about." The room was silent, reverent almost, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing a defining moment, one that would be replayed, dissected, and remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling.